Hello, everybody. I am Dr. Steve Johnson. I want to welcome you today to my YouTube channel, Psychotherapy Education and Training, and for what I think is a special topic, one that I haven't done very much, and that is REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy's behavioral techniques, which I consider to be a practical tool or a set of practical tools for more immediate change, or change also over time. I want to welcome all of those of you who financially support this channel that allow me to do not only these kinds of programs, but I also develop client handouts that you can give to clients, and I will be sending those out pretty regularly now that the school year is over and I have much more time to do this. So today I want to jump in and look at practical tools for change, behavioral techniques within REBT. Excuse me. Many clinicians, understand the cognitive side of REBT. We can identify irrational beliefs, challenge some of those, such as demandingness, and even help clients dispute awfulizing, which can be quite common within REBT. But as you notice, if you're a clinician, there are sometimes clients who still don't change. Why is that the case? Well, one thing, and I did a video on this just a few days ago, is because insight alone is often not enough to bring about the change. And, if we go back to the origin of REBT, it was never meant to be cognitive only. I know the first term for it was rational therapy, and then rational emotive therapy, and then finally rational emotive behavioral therapy that gets all those components in there. But from the very beginning, Albert Ellis strongly emphasized behavioral change, such as acting against irrational beliefs and tolerating discomfort and building new habits through action, repeated actions, so that those behaviors and actions become solidified and habitual. So today what I want to do is focus on that behavioral side of REBT. Maybe it will help you introduce more behavioral techniques that may, be quite effective for individual clients who are working on things. So here's the question. The question is not, what are you telling yourself? The question that we would give to a client is not just, what are you telling yourself? Because that will get at the cognitive side. And that's very, very important to do. Certainly not minimizing the cognitive interventions that are so important within REBT, but also, what are you doing that keeps this problem alive? Because as we'll see later, some conditions such as anxiety, the individual engages in avoidance, and when we avoid it, we don't change the behavior, and we solidify the anxiety and don't help the client move away from that anxiety. But there's another question. What must you do differently to get better, to get well, and to change in really helpful ways? So I want to go through the various techniques within REBT that help with these behavioral changes. And the first one that I want to cover is reinforcement. We know that behavior is reinforcement tends to continue. When we reinforce behavior, then that behavior tends to continue. So What behaviors are being rewarded? When we're working with a client, if we ask ourselves, what are they doing in terms of their actions, behaviors that are being rewarded? What avoidance patterns are accidentally being strengthened by the client? What emotional reactions are being reinforced? Are we reinforcing anger and exaggerated expressions of anger? And clients then end up justifying that rather than making change. So here we want to focus then on reinforcing behaviors that are helpful. We don't want to reinforce negative behaviors, but we want to reinforce behaviors that would be helpful through, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, or reinforcing rational action and reducing reinforcement for the dysfunctional patterns that the client is exhibiting. So clinically, this is what we need to kind of be focusing on as therapists. Clients often unknowingly reward conditions such as anxiety, avoidance, reassurance seeking, right? And so often if you have a client who's highly, highly anxious, they may want you to reassure them that the negative thing that they're projecting will not happen. Well, you can't make that kind of reassurance because we have no control over reality to a great degree. So, and if we engage in reassurance, giving them reassurance for the reassurance seeking, we're not helping the client. We're actually solidifying the problem. Or, emotional dependency. If they don't act upon, healthy behaviors, then healthy beliefs, then they may become more emotionally dependent on us within the session to kind of do the work for them, which will not help them. The second thing I want to look at is penalties or response cost. I probably should work on that a little more than I do. And sometimes consequences matter. Not punishment for cruelty, but consequences for responsibility. Many of the things that we learn early in life, because we may be a little naive when we're young, we learn through the consequences of those of the actions. There may be natural consequences, response costs, accountability structures, behavioral contracting that we can do to kind of help them. But we want to make an important distinction when we do this. We want them to see the consequences, the negative consequences of their beliefs and behaviors, but to do so without shaming and blaming, but helping them to take responsibility for their actions within their lives. That is very important. No shame, no blame. We are helping clients learn that if I continue this behavior, there are predictable consequences. I have a seminar class that I teach, and there are some students that don't jump in and participate. And there are consequences because as a seminar course, if you don't participate, your grade goes down. I'm sad when that's the case, but the seminar is about sharing information and ideas and brainstorming together. And if the student is not taking those kinds of actions, then there's a natural consequence. It's a predictable consequence, grade-wise, for them. I don't like it, and I try never to shame them, but Albert Ellis said the goal of psychotherapy is to accept reality as it is without unduly disturbing ourselves about it. And so we will see the consequences, and we hope they begin to act. The third kind of behavioral intervention that I want to look at is probably the most well-known, and actually one of the most powerful REBT techniques, and that's shame attacking exercises. And I would like to read you a passage that Albert Ellis wrote in his wonderful book. I hope if you have the time and some spare money that you can buy this book called Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, a therapist's guide by Albert Ellis and Catherine McLaren. And on page 94 in that book, and I'll read this to you, and actually the passage appeared in an earlier book by Albert Ellis called Better, Deeper, and More Enduring Brief Therapy from 1996. He wrote, I realized soon after I started doing REBT in 1955 that what we call shame is the essence of a great deal of our emotional disturbance. Because when we do something that we consider shameful, we normally criticize our acts and tell ourselves, that is bad. I better stop doing this and prevent myself from doing it again. We then feel sorry, regretful, or uncomfortable about doing this shameful thing, and we help ourselves refrain from repeating it. So defining one or more of our acts or behaviors as shameful is often useful, and our human tendency to experience this kind of act-directed shame has helped to socialize us, to prevent us from doing wrong or antisocial actions, and to probably help preserve our communities and the human race. Unless we naturally and easily sometimes feel shame, embarrassment, humiliation, and similar emotions about some of our actions, we would not tend to follow many useful and self-preservative rules and would get into fairly steady trouble. However, and this part is really important and is the heart of shame attack exercises. However, partly because of the human tendency to overgeneralize, just about all of us, including you and your clients, tend not only to rate our deeds, acts, and performances, which is good, but also to rate and measure ourselves, our being, our personhood, which is incorrect and inefficient. That is what we do with shame. Label our foolish and antisocial acts as rotten, but also when we really feel ashamed, we measure our entire selves as rotten or shameful. Seeing this, I created my most famous shame attacking exercise in 1968, and perhaps millions of people, especially psychotherapy clients, have done this exercise and trained themselves to feel ashamed or sorry about what they did and about the public disapproval that often went with it, but not to put themselves down and not to feel humiliated about their entire personhood. Great quote. And that gives the spirit of the shame attacking exercise. And as I said, it is one of the most powerful REBT methods. Clients often suffer, as he said here, not only from events, but from the terror of disapproval, embarrassment, and humiliation. The goal here then is learn that shame is survivable. So the focus is what the client is going through: fear of judgment, social embarrassment, imperfection tolerance. Unconditional self-acceptance is where we want them to get, okay? The principle: I can survive looking foolish. This is especially useful for social anxiety, perfectionism, guilt, and approval addiction, really. So how do we do it? We ask the client to do something that they would normally be ashamed to do. And preferably in public, but nothing that would get them into trouble. Nothing that would, be illegal, get them arrested, have them lose their job, disrupt a relationship, but something that's minor, but they would perceive as shameful. So, for example, when I was in New York at the Albert Ellis Institute, I tried a shame attacking exercise. There was this wonderful little shop that was just about a block or two from the Institute. And I would walk up there and they had this wonderful kind of food bar, with salads and then also some hot food. And you would choose a container, a plastic container. They were of different sizes, put food in it, take it up, they'd measure it, and then you would pay whatever the fee was for the weight. Excuse me. So I did it, but I put one grape in the biggest container that they had. And then I went up and they measured it and I said, oh, can I get a plastic knife and a fork to go with it? Before doing it, I said, I'm going to look so stupid, right, to do this. And I was like walking around and thinking, no, I better put some other stuff in there. Otherwise, they're just going to yell at me and tell me to get out and all that kind of stuff. But I did it. And, it's New York. They just looked up, then said, had a good day. And I went on. So the dreaded, horrible consequence being thought of as silly, etc. by them, well, they may have thought that, but there was no horrible consequence. So it's an excellent technique. Another one that Dr. Ellis talked about is skill training. Sometimes the problem is not just an irrational belief. Sometimes the client genuinely lacks a skill to get something done. So let me give you some example social skills, and I'll show that one in a minute. How I worked with a group on social skills, assertive communication, emotional regulation, conflict management, recovery routines. I work with a number of clients with addictions and trauma associated with the addictions too. So those are the things that situations that might use this. Important reminder is that we never dispute a skill deficit. We teach it. Insight without competence creates frustration. So let me give an example. I had a group of teenage, young men, and their parents wanted them to join a group because of their social awkwardness, the parents said, and they didn't know how to interact in helpful ways for them, and the young men realized that this was a problem for them. And so we started some work on it, but I found out that all of the guys were interested in getting a date for the prom. So the social skills training group quickly became how to get a date, or at least how to work to try to get a date for the prom. And it was I think I've never had as much fun as I have in that particular group. I remember one young man said, hey, how about I say, would you like to learn about a camera? And the guys were, arguing back and forth and saying, yeah, no. And they had a great discussion about that. And they came to the decision that, it would take a special young lady that would be interested in a camera. And then another one said, how about magic? And that one quickly got shut down by the guys because they said you would look silly and what kind of magic would. So we practice on how would you ask a young lady out? What would you say? What would you not say? And to my amazement, every one of the young men got a date for the prom. And so I said, what's your next one? But they were just so happy to have gotten a date. They weren't even thinking about the second date. So that was a real helpful use of skills training. And some of the cognitions, as a result of that change, they were not as afraid to approach a young lady. Now, the fifth behavioral intervention that I want to talk about is paradoxical homework. Now, for some people, this is controversial, but sometimes direct resistance makes symptoms stronger. And so, what do we do here? If we come up with a paradoxical intervention, that can actually reduce the struggle. So here's some examples. Schedule anxiety time, which I do frequently. Deliberately make small mistakes, especially for those individuals with perfectionism or problems with social anxiety. Practice imperfect performance, not on something that would, have you get a low job rating or get fired or something like that, or intentionally delay reassurance. Prescribe the symptom very, very carefully. So what's the goal here? Reduce the fear by removing the war. If it seems this huge thing, then often there'll be avoidance or fear about doing it. So if we remove the war and just prescribe the symptom, then sometimes the resistance goes down. So goal, reduce the fear by removing the war against discomfort, especially helpful for perfectionism, obsessive worry, panic sensitivity, and control struggles. So prescribing the symptom with anxiety, typically I will do, I'm not saying it is the right way or anything like that. You experiment with it, see whether it's appropriate for a client. And you say, every evening, what's a good time? When do you have some open time? They go, around 7 o'clock, kids are in bed or kids are busy doing homework or whatever. And so we go, okay, from 7 to 7:15, I want you to sit down and make yourself about as anxious as you can get. One of the things they frequently do is that they believe, often the clients and sometimes ourselves believe, that we have no control over this. But if we say, sit down and make yourself feel as anxious as you can in those 10 or 15 minutes, they kind of, without us making a huge point, realize that they do have some agency to control some of that anxiety, unless it's really egregious. So that is one way. I've heard of a colleague for someone who was experiencing depression and had embraced this helplessness. He said, "Okay, let's play it out. You're helpless, and so you cannot do anything to help yourself." And he goes, "Anything? No, not right now. Not for the next few minutes, at least." And so a session was over. The young man, or I think it was a young man, went to open the door. He goes, "No, wait a minute. You're helpless. You can't open that door." And he goes, and then it hit him that he's not totally helpless. And then the therapist said, "Okay, I wanted you to see that you are not as helpless as you think. There are all kinds of things that you can do. But once you hold that rigid belief about yourself, it holds you back in so many different ways." Now, don't go and act helpless for the rest of the day. Okay, we've made the point, etc. The sixth one that I want to talk about is one that is a huge part of my life, because I deal with individuals who are struggling with addiction and relapse. So let's take a quick look at this. But there's relapse of all kinds of things. Someone might have overcome procrastination, and then they kind of slipped back into procrastinating, and they need some work on that. As I said, the relapse prevention can be extremely important in addiction treatment. Clients need preparation, not just motivation. They need preparation for this, not motivation. And one of the things that I kind of refrain from is to over-normalize relapse. I don't want to shame or blame or anything like that if there is a relapse, but to, instead of shame and blame and self-downing, seeing themselves as failures and that they ruin the lives of everybody around them, I want them to take this as a learning event, and to be very serious, particularly with some drugs. The wiggle room in terms of the safety is not great, and there can be huge consequences. So we do want to be very serious about the relapse. We need to prepare them for that, because some people go, well, they just lack motivation. Motivation is not the issue. Some of the individuals who suffer addiction are the most motivated people in the world, maybe not in the way you want them to be motivated, but they can have high motivation. So we want to do some preparation so they will have motivation in those areas that you're hoping that they'll embrace. So focus is, what are we trying to do? We want to prepare them for high-risk situations where, let's say, they tended to drink when they were with particular people and they went to particular places. So those would be high-risk situations. So we will prepare them to act in particular ways there, and to brainstorm those actions and the supports in those settings so that they don't act unhelpfully within the high-risk situation or with emotional triggers. I was talking the other day to an individual who said there were two triggers for him. One trigger was boredom, and the other trigger was when they had the belief that that their spouse just didn't care about them at all. Those were the two emotional triggers that they had around that, and then they tended to drink. So we began to work on the behaviors that needed to be engaged in or exemplified within in the face of those triggers and high-risk situation, or even with cravings and urges within addiction. All kinds of addictions, behavioral addictions, drug addiction, any kind of addiction or craving and urges can be there. And so we have develop an alternative behavioral repertoire so that they maybe like surf the urges or the cravings rather than act in unhelpful ways. We give them alternative behaviors and alternative cognitions to go along with that behavioral intervention. We also have them plan the future, develop rational coping statements that they can use. I like short, rational coping statements that the clients develop themselves. In some group situations, if we're looking at this, they have a book that they create and they write themselves at the end of each of the group sessions some rational coping statements, and they share those with each other. And at the beginning of the next session, people can look in there and we can talk about these rational coping statements. And we use that in REBT quite frequently anyway, so that's helpful. So let's just look at some of the techniques in that. One is just guided imagery. We can walk them through that. We can do behavioral rehearsal. That's really important. I mean, if any of you have had children, and we always try to help them learn not to just go off. If they say they're in the park or something and someone comes up to them and says, "Would you like to pet my puppy?" And it's just over here by my car. Then, parents' greatest fear. And so we would tell them not to do this, and we walk and say it. And then if we did it, and there are videos about this, you'd go to a park and you'd play this out with the stranger to the child, but the parents know because they want to keep the situation safe. And so the person said, "Do you want to pet my puppy?" The puppy is right there. And the child almost invariably went off. So what we did then was, instead of just doing it cognitively, we would take the child to the park with the puppy, have someone come up to them and say, do you want to pet my puppy? Or would you like, or your mommy and daddy told me to pick you up because they're too busy to pick you up. And my car's right here. Instead, we would walk them through that, walk it so that it is behavioral, not just cognitive. So, and then we do that, we can do that in so many, many different ways. I had a friend who was a professor of English who was great in communication, and he would often go to Belgium to work, but he noticed that he was getting very, very anxious right before, not the performance, but the lecture. And so he said he changed his behavior in a small way, and it was very, very helpful. Before he got there early and before anybody had arrived, he stood by the door where people would come in, and he would say, "Welcome to my lecture. I'm so happy that you came to be with me." So he took ownership of that, which changed his attitude. Rather than seeing himself as inadequate, it was his place. And he was kind of thinking that they were kind of blessed to be there, and that helped change his whole attitude. That's a behavioral change that he made, and he rehearsed that. So that's what I mean by behavioral rehearsal, or even role playing within the session with the client. And as I said before, urge surfing preparation. There's this wonderful book called Sex, Drugs, Gambling, and Chocolate by Horvath. And he does a great job of describing the urge surfing preparation. Also, if you look at Smart Recovery, if you go online to their website, they have videos, and they will talk about urges and cravings, and urge surfing is covered in one of the videos and in the manual that Smart Recovery has that you could purchase, especially if you're working with that particular population. Or recovery scripts, scripts that they write with your help and in ways that they can, they're writing it out, they're reading it, they're practicing it. So it's a lot of different skills in one intervention, which I really, 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 really like. The question then becomes, what will you do when the urge comes? Not, do you hope it won't? Hoping that it won't is not enough. That's cognitive. But what will you do is behavioral. It's the action, and they practice that. Another one is the seventh one that I want to cover is what Albert called in vivo desensitization. This is when we have repeated exposure to feared situations. Not endless talking about fear, but direct experience with it. I had several fears, and one of them was the fear of flying. And then I started getting requests to lecture in other countries. And so, oh man, what am I going to do? Because I thought I'll flip out, I'll go crazy, and I won't know what to do, etc. And that was my self-talk. I would not talk that way to another human, but my self-talk was really derogatory and to myself and my capability. And so I just started flying, and I would take, I began with requests that were really close, and then gradually I was flying overseas, and it really, really helped. And I thought about that, I think it was just last year, I was flying from South Carolina to New York City. Excuse me. We have the pollen in the air where I live, and so I'm sorry that I've had to cough several times. But I was flying, and the worst turbulence I had ever experienced in my life. And we were bounced around. It was dead silent, except for some people crying. And I was just, I didn't like it. It was not pleasant, but I did much, much better than I thought. Before if I heard that there was going to be turbulence, I would have canceled right there and just lost the money. But I found myself able to do it, and I've encountered turbulence thereafter, and I'm pretty good with it. Not pleasant. I wouldn't want to sign up for it necessarily and say, hey, create turbulence, whoever's in charge of that. But that it was moving beyond the endless talking about what I ought to do, how to address the fear, and just have direct experience with it. I have some of my students do that when they're afraid to get up and talk. And one that's really important, I supervise a lot of individuals in learning REBT. And at the end of the course, a graduate course that I teach in this, when it comes the day when we do, they're practicing actually using the ABCD model, and they get up there and I say, guys, please don't think about perfection. In fact, what I want you to do to help all of us, I want you to make two mistakes in the session. If you make more, I will know you're an overachiever, but at least two mistakes. And then the responsibility is for us to identify that. And we noticed that they all reported that their anxiety level went really, really down. I was prescribing the fear or the fear of failure or whatever they were going through at the time, but having them have direct experience, but with some reframing of what success would mean to help with that. And one of the ways that we can do that is in vivo desensitization, is after they've done that, is just say, what did you learn from this? And have a really uplifting discussion about that and where they found that strength to do that. So the focus here is on this is gradual exposure. In REBT, we were certainly not against flooding. I'm a little more cautious with individuals with substance use disorder who also have co-occurring PTSD. I often don't want flooding. Otherwise, the dissociation could go up, and then the relapse potential might be high. But for many other things, some clients want flooding. I talk about the upside and the downside of flooding, as I would with anything. And then, but often, especially if the anxiety or whatever the emotion is really high, I might shift to gradual exposure, anxiety tolerance, helping them to do that, disconfirmation of catastrophic beliefs, and behavioral courage. I know in some, like in solution-focused therapy, they will if someone is engaging in avoidance and they have some fear, they often will have them do some exposure and then give them a certificate of vanquishing the dragon or whatever it is. I think it's a wonderful way to acknowledge their success. And I think clients learn that anxiety decreases when avoidance decreases. Avoidance teaches danger. Exposure teaches survivability, I think. The eighth one that I want to talk about is staying in difficult but safe situations. And it's really important to put but safe situations. And many clients escape too early, leaving too quickly. Teaches the brain, yes, this really was dangerous. The therapist's task here is help them stay long enough for the anxiety to peak and then to begin to reduce. Not easy sometimes. Examples are that you use this with social discomfort or conflictual conversations where one immediately checks out and the other one is pursuing. In fact, I have one of the things that I'm making available to those of you who join the channel and for your support. One of the things that I give is this kind of timeout protocol for when there's conflict between the two, but we introduce some grounding and some other things to it, and we want the conversation to continue, but under kind of a different dynamic. Another situation is public speaking, of course, urges and cravings, which I've already covered, or emotional vulnerability. Some people are very afraid of being emotionally vulnerable. They're afraid people sometimes may use that in ways that will harm them. We teach, brainstorming, beginning to use wisdom, look at taking measurable risk, all of those kinds of things, so that we can help them move beyond being too vulnerable. We hope that some people will be vulnerable. That's part of a relationship. But it's really important that we realize that safety matters. Flooding recklessly is not treatment. Flooding recklessly is not. Right now, I'm working with a group of individuals with substance use disorder who also had co-occurring PTSD. There's some data that shows that in that particular population, residential treatment, the percentage of individuals with substance use disorder who also have co-occurring PTSD is about 90 to 95%. So very sizable. What we want to do is what the research shows is that treating the addiction and the trauma simultaneously can be helpful, but we should not do that recklessly. And so often I will give a dissociation measure, and we will be very aware of what are the symptoms of dissociation, so that we can take action so that safety is maintained. And we don't want to put them in a situation that might put them at risk for lapse or relapse. Okay. The ninth one is acting on rational beliefs. And I can't think of a client that I don't use this with. This is the heart of REBT behavior work. A rational belief must become lived behavior. We don't want to just have rational beliefs, but not act upon them. What's the value of having that insight, but not putting that insight behind the action? So we don't want them to know I should, but I will act as if the rational belief is true. And that's what we do. And I do it in a couple of ways. Act as if the rational belief is true. And sometimes the way I introduce that is take a first step, a small step. Act into the self that you want to be. And we have discussions about what would be the values of the self there. What would be the traits that individual would have? Okay, then let's act upon the helpful belief toward that, or act into the self that you want to be with the traits that you want to have. Some examples might be speaking despite the anxiety, apologizing despite pride or thinking that you were absolutely right and you did nothing wrong. But, sometimes apologizing. Now, must you? Don't think you absolutely have to. This is if you think it's in your best interest. But don't turn that into a demand either. That would not be helpful. Or setting boundaries despite having guilt, not taking on way too much and making yourself feel guilty in multiple domains of life, where you then it almost becomes a part of you, okay? Rather than just an occasional occurrence. Staying sober despite cravings, tolerating uncertainty despite discomfort. And we're going to see that in anxiety and OCD, right? They want individuals with those conditions. Many of us want to have certainty, but we also realize that we can't get certainty on most things unless we utterly avoid, but then your life becomes very small, and that's not helpful. But we want to help them tolerate uncertainty. despite discomfort. Not, in other words, we're changing a cognition, not demand certainty. That cognition won't help, that belief won't help, but also act into the uncertainty. Learn to, study it a bit, try to do the best you can, come up with a plan, and then act into it, despite not knowing everything that can go wrong. Okay? And so I think these behavioral techniques can be really, really helpful. Rationality becomes real when the behavior changes. I think the final test of REBT is not intellectual agreement. It's behavioral evidence. Having a client agree that, yeah, that makes sense, having these particular beliefs make sense, that's good, but they need to go beyond that. We're not an insight-only therapy. We want behavioral evidence that the individual is acting against the dysfunctional belief and acting upon the rational beliefs. So it's not, do you understand the rational belief? That's part of it. It's not that here, but are you living it? REBT asks clients to think differently, but also act differently, feel differently, and ultimately become different. Behavior is where the philosophy of REBT becomes reality. And that's what that's our goal, okay? So I want to thank all of you. I hope some of it was helpful to individuals. And so I did see someone had a question, and we'll take a look at this real briefly. And that is, would you advise delving into the client's inferences or beliefs entailing predictable consequences outcome when they slip back or are tempted to fall back into acting out? I think this is a very excellent question. And so, Alex, what I would say here is I often, and part of before I even get to the interventions, one of the things that I want to check is the what their inferences are and whether those inferences across domains of life and what their beliefs are, and part of what I want there is are they making a projection into the future? Often we will see that with anxiety. Very roughly, depression tends to be focus on the past, and anxiety about the future. So I want to know what that prediction is, because then that prediction will help me set up, in collaboration with them, a behavioral intervention. Okay, or I take a look at their behavior, and if their behavior is not according to the goal that they said or the belief that they had embraced, then I know that I need to go back, and I will start looking at inference, start looking at beliefs, also see if there are high-risk situations, triggers, all of those kinds of things. If there are, then how can we fortify them in moving forward and help them embrace some of the behavioral interventions that I just talked about. But thanks so much, Alex, for asking that wonderful question. Well, I don't see any other questions right now, but feel free to get a hold of me. If you see this pop up, then you can always, on YouTube, then you can always ask some questions, make comments there, and I'm more than happy to do that. Please consider joining, and you would get first crack at any of the new things that are coming up, such as this one. This one will show up later, but I hope you enjoyed it, and I do thank you so much. And I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day. All the best.